I think we're going to get started today because it's already 2 minutes after the hour. We are going to pick up where we left off last time. Last time we were talking on the whole question of how do we get our food. Now this is, if you remember your anthropological theory, we said that I would be organizing the class around a Malinowskian or functionalist approach to culture. In other words, culture is a way of solving life's problems. And one of life's problems is how to get food. So we are looking at food gathering methods. I told the T's I shouldn't eat nuts beforehand because I'd start choking. Sure enough, there we are. Got it out of the system now. So we started out with two forms of food production. Number one was hunting and gathering. And the second one was a nomadic lifestyle. Now, I don't know, have any of you ever read that book, Heidi? Did you ever read it in grade school or wherever? Only one person will admit to reading Heidi. 2, 3, okay, 4, okay, well, there are a few of you. It's actually a great little book. I always had a problem reading about girls because I always wanted to read about cowboys. I was kind of emotionally retarded in that respect. You didn't have to laugh that vigorously. But Heidi's a great little book. And you remember the girl is a sickly little girl. And so she goes up to live with her grandfather in the mountains. And he's a herder. He herds goats. And she engages in that lifestyle. She meets a little herder boy and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then she comes down off of the mountain when it starts getting closer on to winter and it's going to be pretty harsh. And one of the things that impresses her are the fresh rolls that she can get in the city. And she realizes this is a luxury that her grandfather doesn't have because he doesn't have access to the grains that are available from farming communities. And so she starts stuffing the fresh rolls into her bag to give to her grandfather without realizing that the bread will, of course, get stale and hard. But it's a marvelous study of a herder's lifestyle versus an agriculturalist lifestyle, which is one of the things that makes it one of the classics. So it's a great story, and if you want to read it, but you don't want to be accused of being, kind of juvenile, read it to your cousins or nieces or nephews or whoever, and that gives you a chance to read it and spend some quality time with a younger person in your family. Oh, okay, never mind. You're already reading philosophy and stuff like that. Well, today we're going to be looking at more advanced forms of agriculture. And then in our next lecture, we'll talk about how agriculture led then to the emergence of early civilizations and the organization into pristine states. So again, our little chart, we've done worldview, we're doing production systems. We will continue production systems through this lecture topic number 5. And we're going to start out with farming. Farming does take place. Now, I told you about the hunting and gathering people who lived north of us down in what we call the Lakes Plains, where they went up and down the rivers and they would look for breadfruit trees. They would look for other places where there were fruit that they could harvest. They would fish on the river, and actually in their canoes, they would build a little hearth. They would put clay in the back of the canoe, and Grandma would sit. Well, actually, they put it in the bow of the canoe, now that I think about it. They would put a little hearth up there with clay, and Grandma would sit up front, and the son would stand in the back poling the canoe, and the rest of the family would be in the center. And her job would be to keep the coals alive, and if they caught any fish, they'd pull it in, and they would clean it, get it ready. They'd give it to Grandma, and Grandma could either try to cook it up front, or she could just kind of hold on to it until they stopped on a bank, and she would start up a fire, and they would cook supper on a river bank. Oftentimes they would build a small dwelling on the bank of the river so that they could get out of their canoes, and they would have these temporary houses on stilts. And if they built some of these houses, and they would have several of them up and down the river, they would begin to cut down some of the trees that were around for firewood. And eventually, over the period of time, there would be a little clearing around these houses that they had up and down the river banks. And frequently, they would plant something in there. They would plant maybe some bananas. And so not only did they have trees that had breadfruit, they might be able to say, oh, hey, remember we planted some bananas back here? Let's check that out. Oh, yeah, look, there's a stalk of bananas ready to go. So they'd be able to have breadfruit and bananas or other kinds of crops. And eventually they started a very, very moderate form of agriculture. Now, it wasn't persistent. It wasn't enough to feed them, but it was enough to supplement their hunting and gathering or foraging lifestyle. But they do go more, in some cultures, into actually beginning to cultivate crops. They're going to start purposefully preparing a field to plant a sustained form of food supply for them. And the simplest, least complex form of agriculture is what we call horticulture. After horticulture, we start moving into more intensive forms of agriculture. And after more intensive forms of agriculture, we move into mechanized agriculture, which is what we have today with the use of tractors and professional machinery. And then, of course, we'll be talking, at least next week, on the emergence then of early civilization. Well, let's go back to horticultural societies. There are certain characteristics associated with the early attempts to do agriculture. The characteristic of what anthropologists call horticulture is it is entirely dependent upon the use of hand tools. You might be able to make a hoe. More frequently, you would simply use a digging stick. You would use a digging stick, and you would well, a couple of different kinds of uses of digging sticks. The Dani were a horticultural people. So we watched them go all the way from cutting down the timber, clearing a field, making a patch of land, and planting a garden. The men, once they've cleared a field, would come in with huge digging sticks. They would be fairly long, 5-6 feet long, very sharp on one end, about the size of a 2x2 or even a 3x3 round pole, and they would use that to stab into the soil, to break it loose, to turn it over, to get it all aerated, and then They would break it up into plots, and then the women would come in with their short digging sticks. The short digging sticks that the women used was maybe 2 feet long, and they would come in and then they would break up the large clods. They would plant the sweet potatoes in there, and they would use their short digging sticks then to nurture the sweet potatoes into a very bountiful harvest. In addition to the digging sticks, they would have axes to cut down the trees. And indeed, the Dani that with whom we worked were a prime example of what is referred to in the literature as a Stone Age culture. They had stone axes. They used those stone axes to cut down trees. They made their own stone axes from a stone quarry that was further north of where I was living. And so they had these axes, they had bows and arrows, they had digging sticks. Everything was dependent upon hand tools. In horticultural societies, you also had few domesticated animals. They did not have large herds. You would have a family that would own maybe a couple of animals. In the South Pacific, they would own a few pigs. As a matter of fact, a very wealthy family would own maybe 3 or 4 pigs. They did not own any more than that. And there was a reason why they did not allow their herds to get any bigger. And here's where we have to rely on some studies by material culturalists. These are the folk that interpret human behavior from an ecological perspective. And a scholar by the name of Roy Rappaport went and studied growing strategies and feasting strategies and human labor in a highlands community in Papua. He went over there and he followed men every day for multiple days, chronicling every activity of the day from the time they woke up until the time they came back home at night to sit around the fire chatting before they fell asleep. He then did the same thing for women. And one of the things that he plotted on women's work was what they did from the time that they started their day, went out to the garden, came back, and turned over a net bag full of potatoes for the family to eat. Now, he was doing more than just simply chronicling how many minutes they spent walking to their garden, how many minutes they spent digging in the garden, how many minutes they sat resting, how many minutes they spent coming back. He also calculated the amount of energy expended. And when they came back, he then weighed the amount of food that they brought back. Now, the women would bring back a variety of foods. They would bring back enough food to leave at the men's house for the men to eat. They would then have a second bag of food that they and their children would eat in the family house. And then there would be another bag with little scrawny sweet potatoes that weren't particularly good or nutritious. They were not the better food. They would bring that back and feed to their pigs because they did have to keep their pigs fed. So there would be 3 kinds of foods: the men's food, the family food, the animal food. And he chronicled all of this. How much energy did they expend? And how much energy did they get back in nutritional value from the sweet potatoes that they harvested? Now, it was very meticulous work, but he did a very careful study, and he discovered that a Dani, or not a Dani woman, but a Highlands woman, which would be very, very close culturally to the Dani, the Highland women could manage a garden and keep it productive and produce enough food to be able to feed herself, her husband, 2.5 children. I don't know about that 0.5 kid, but I assume that, no, average. 2.5 children, and could feed approximately 3 pigs. If she had to feed more than 3 pigs, if she had to feed more children, then she becomes overworked. She is not able to give enough physical energy to actually producing food in excess of that. If they wanted a larger herd of pigs, they had to get additional help. How would you do that? Well, maybe one of those kids would be an older teenager who could help out in the gardening. Or maybe you could call upon your mother or your mother-in-law to help out. If you could bring in additional labor, you could raise more food for a larger herd of pigs. But 3 pigs was the optimal size for the average family. Now, this is an important study because it helps to explain how horticultural societies work. You have families producing food for their own personal consumption. They're not selling it in the marketplace. They're simply providing food to survive. So they only want to take care of enough production to feed their family, their herd of pigs. They don't want it to get too big because it will be too onerous a task. So they will have a few domesticated animals. In the South Pacific, it was pigs. In other cultures, it will be goats. Goats are a little bit easier to raise. Goats don't have to be fed food that we produce. They can eat grasses, but somebody has to keep an eye on the goats. You have to have goat herders or swine herders or whatever. So this takes somebody out of production. So every culture is going to have to be organized around not having too many animals that will distract labor from food production. People in horticultural societies will generally live in small villages. What do I mean by a small village? 1, 2, 3, 4 families, maybe a dozen families maximum. Now, before I understood this principle, I would see villages all around, and some of them became quite large villages. And as I became aware of the sociological, cultural requirements of a horticultural society, I began to go back and take a look at these larger villages that I was seeing in Dani culture. And one of the things I discovered was there might be 2 or 3 men's houses sharing the same location, if indeed there was a lot of good fertile ground around that could support their gardens. What I found was what I called shared sites for 3 villages, complex villages. And so I would go to this men's house, and then I would go up to the top of the circle there and find another men's house. And so you had essentially no more than 6 to 8 families living in any single men's house, but you might have up to 24 families living in one location. They were small villages. These were the kinds of villages where the people could get along, they could supply one another's needs, they could create effective work communities. And labor in horticultural societies tends to be very cooperative. Nobody works on their own plot of land by themselves. They farm cooperatively. They work together. We saw this whenever there was a need for a new garden. The men would sit around and talk about, we need a new garden. Our current gardens are beginning to dry up. And then they would talk about, where do we want to put in the new garden? They would find a new garden or new spot up on the hill somewhere or further up valley. They would then talk about, we need to go up there and cut down the timber on that. So they would get together the work parties. They would go up. They would cut down the trees. They would send out messages to all of the surrounding villages. We're going to put in a new garden. Come help us put in the new garden. So they would get a large work party together. The large work party would come out, help cut down the trees. They would split the trees into planks so that they could make a fence around the garden to keep pigs out of the food that they would be planting there. They would help to set up the garden into plots of land. And once they've set up the plots of land, then they would be assigned to families. Now, if you're going to turn, let's say, 4 acres of jungle into a garden, they would do that. So now you've got a 4-acre plot of land that is now ready for gardening. This was done primarily on behalf of, let's say, the village of Weedigale. Now, people from all the surrounding villages have come to help the Weedigale people put in their new garden. When it comes time to put the gardens in, only the Weedigale people will be able to actually plant in that garden, even though everybody has participated. And they will divide it up according to people's need. So here's Tuambanuk. Tuambanuk has 1 wife, 3 kids. So he needs a certain size plot to be able to feed his family. But then comes Urutagay. And Urutagay, he's got 2 wives and 6 kids. So he needs a bigger plot of land. So he will be given 2 plots, double the size of his fellow villager. The question here is, how much can they take care of and manage? How much do they need? It was a true sharing system that allowed them to be able to build a garden big enough to meet everybody's needs and managed according to the needs of the family. So, shared labor. When they got done putting that garden in, then they would join in a work party for another village, help them put in a garden, help the next valley. So every valley could call upon their neighbors to come help them put in their gardens. Now, they tried as much as possible to turn work parties into literal parties. Now, I don't know, anybody here a John Denver fan? There's a couple of you. Johnny Denver, he's got this cute little song about, tending his little garden and how wonderful gardening is. Don't believe Johnny Denver. I don't think he ever got a scrap of dirt under his fingernails. Gardening is not fun. Gardening is boring work. You spend hours upon hours, pulling up weeds, turning over dirt. I mean, talk about a mind-numbing job. And it's hot in the sun. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why this is horrible to say, but why we got slaves to do it, because we didn't want to do all that work. Who wants to pick cotton in a hot sun? See? Get somebody and whip them into shape to do it. And that's what we did. We developed a whole slave system to get people to do the work that we didn't want to do. Gardening is not fun. And every culture in the world has discovered that. So how do you make it fun? You get everybody together and you have a party and you share the labor and you sing and you dance and you have all kinds of socializing and all the young people show up and the young people, they're flirting, they're showing off, they're doing all kinds of neat stuff and it becomes a social event. gardening became a social event that would help communities bond together. So it was a cooperative event, and many hands made for light work. Good old American proverb. Well, societies in horticultural societies are socially organized by kin group. And so you all live together as families. And one of the other discoveries that I came across was the discovery that the villages were all related people. I did a very, very careful analysis of the members of each men's house, took down their names, found out their relationships to one another. And what I discovered was they were all brothers, brother-in-laws, cousins, nephews, uncles, all members of one large extended family. Now, every now and again, they might bring in an outsider who would become a pretend relative. Oh yeah, he's my brother. He's not really, but he's kind of adopted us, we've kind of adopted him. But they would develop fictive kinship relationships so that they could all live together. You could not just move to any valley you wanted. You could not just move into any region and take up residence and be accepted as an insider. You had to be there by kinship bonds. And they engaged in what we call subsistence agriculture. Now, subsistence agriculture, this is a very specific definition. Subsistence agriculture, it means you grow for your own personal use. You're not growing food to sell. You are growing food to eat it, to subsist, to survive. So you grow just enough food for you and your family to survive. Now, if you're living in a community, you may want to include people in the extended family. You may want to share food between your families, but you are just growing it for your own personal use. Now, every now and again, you will have a bumper harvest. And if you have a bumper harvest and you have got more food than you can possibly eat, that's when you have a feast. You share it with other people. And I have been at many, many feasts where there was a bumper harvest. We even had one year, we had a cucumber festival. And for some reason or another, we just had a bumper harvest of cucumbers. We had thousands of pounds of cucumbers. And they didn't know what to do with them. And you know what? You can't turn cucumbers into pickles and make them last longer unless you have, jars and vinegar and all that sort of stuff. So they had to eat the cucumbers right away. So they called for a cucumber festival. And people came from miles around to sit around eating cucumbers, and we had a marvelous time. Now they threw in a little bit of extra food to go with the cucumbers, but we had a cucumber festival. And I must admit, when I first went to Irian Jaya, I did not particularly like cucumbers. It's just not my favorite food. But you know what, when you get hungry enough, you'll eat anything, including dirt. And cucumbers, oh man, did I get to liking cucumbers. I'll even make cucumbers on my salad now. But we would have cucumbers and we would sit around and talk about the cucumbers. And then on another year, we had a horrendous surplus of pandanus fruit. And pandanus fruit is a long red fruit, and you can steam it up in a steam pit, and then break it up, and you mix a little water with it. You can make it into a nice red paste, and then you can eat it with a little branch of the pandanus plant. It has a leaf that's very stiff. You can turn it into kind of a spoon, and you can then spoon the pudding out of the bowl that they would make, and it was really delicious. If you've ever eaten chalk, that's sort of what it tastes like, except it's red. Terrible tasting stuff, but with a little salt on it, it was pretty good. The really nice thing about the red pandanus was it was not a narcotic, but it would give you just a slight buzz. You know what I mean? You know, you'd really mellow out after eating pandanus pudding, you know, and that night, oh, you'd have really, really sweet dreams. And everybody kind of loved going to a pandanus pudding party. And at one point, I even sponsored a pandanus pudding party and got folk to help improve the airstrip where we were working. We needed to make some changes to the airstrip, so we called for a pandanus pudding party, and everybody came and worked all day long, and we would feed them pandanus pudding at the end of the day, and everybody'd go home, you know, feeling really good. We had pandanus nut parties. We had peanut parties. Oh, just all kinds of parties. Because what do you do with surplus food? You give it away. You build social ties. You invite your neighbors to come together. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a block party in your community. We don't have block parties anymore, but I remember growing up, we had a block party. I grew up in the Midwest, and my parents decided to throw a fall block party, and all of the neighbors were invited, and we went down, and we used to, I mean, this is really going back, we used to go buy all of our vegetables off of horse-drawn wagons that would come into the city. I mean, when I lived in downtown Toronto, just a couple of blocks off of Skid Row. But 2 blocks up behind my home, there was a city park, and farmers would come in from the country on their horse-drawn wagons during the night, and they would park along the curb, and then in the morning, we would go up and we would buy vegetables by the bushel basket. And then I would haul it home on my wagon with my parents, and then we would shuck the corn, and then we would can it in jars, and we would can peaches, and we would can corn, and we would can beans, and we would put up a whole cellar full of canned vegetables for the winter. And we were in the process of doing that, and because it was an abundant harvest and we had a little extra cash, my father threw a block party, and we had we got a oil barrel and filled it with water, built a fire underneath of it, started boiling all the water, put, I don't know, dozens of ears of corn into the boiling water and cooked it, and we had corn and watermelon for our block party. Now, the adults also had beer, but we kids weren't allowed to that. But I remember eating corn on the cob until I was yellow in the face. And we had watermelon seed spitting contests as kids, who could spit watermelon. I mean, we just had a wonderful time. That's what subsistence farmers did. They turned excess food into an occasion to build community. You are growing the food for yourselves. Well, there are different ways of farming if you are in horticultural societies. One of them is what we've already described as stick gardening, or sometimes referred to as dry land gardening. Now, Native Americans on the eastern seaboard tended to practice this kind of stick gardening. Here's what they did. There would be a small glen or a small field, and the Native Americans would work very hard through forest management procedures to maintain these open meadows. They would do so by setting them on fire on a regular basis. They would burn off any scrub or brush that would start to grow up in the meadow in order to keep them open. Once they had kept that field open, then the women would come in and they would be expected to plant corn. Now, here's one of the techniques that Native Americans on the eastern seaboard use. The women would come into a meadow like this. They've got a sharp stick. They would take that stick and plunge a hole into the soil. Then they would reach into a pouch and pull out 2 kernels of corn. Drop them into the hole. Then they would reach into another pouch and pull out a little minnow and drop it into the hole. Then they would take their foot and cover it over. Then they would go a few steps, poke a hole, drop in a minnow, drop in 2 kernels of corn, cover it up with their foot, and they would plant the entire field with corn. Now, were they trying to grow fish? No, they weren't trying to grow fish. Why'd they put the fish down in the hole? Fertilizer. Duh. Fish make good. Now the little minnows, they're not big enough to eat. The big fish they were eating, the little minnows that they were capturing, good for fertilizer. So they would use the fish for fertilizer, drop in a couple of kernels of corn. Why 2 kernels? Because sometimes one of them's not going to germinate. Sometimes they'll both come up and they will pick the healthier looking of the 2, pull the other one out. They knew about how to do genetic testing. They knew how to maximize the ability to get food. They knew how to use fertilizer. They were doing what we would call dry land gardening. And it was very effective. And when the Puritans arrived, the Puritans had never seen corn. Are you aware of that? Corn was a New World food. Nobody in Europe ate corn prior to 1492. In the 1600s, when the Puritans arrived, corn was still a fairly new product. The Puritans did not know how to plant corn. They had to learn it from the Native Americans. They showed them how to do it. It was a great winter crop because you could put the corn in your cellar or in a food storage place, and you could preserve it to last during the cold winter months, and it could be ground up into corn paste and made into cornmeal. So they taught the European settlers how to grow corn. It was a very efficient method. The Puritans started bringing in new technology. They started bringing in plows so that they moved beyond stick gardening. But that's a later story. Stick gardening. Now, when it comes to stick gardening, there was minimal land preparation. All you had to do was make sure you had a glade or a glen or a pasture or an open place. You could do this with a little silviculture or forest agriculture management. It would leave minimal impact upon the ecology. Once you stopped farming, it would go back to growing back into forest. And these gardens could supplement your available food supply, so you could still live off of the annual crops that came in. You could still live off of the wild turnips, the wild plants that grew out there. You could subsidize it with additional food. But this was only typical in temperate cultures. That is, up here in what would be North America, and actually, if you go back several hundreds of years more, it was what you would have found in Europe, and actually all the way down into the Middle East. When you start getting down into the tropics, you've got another whole phenomenon you have to deal with. You have to, stick culture is not going to work nearly as well in the tropics. In the tropics, you're going to have what we call slash and burn or shifting agriculture. Now, they are doing slash and burn or shifting agriculture for very good ecological reasons. Like I say, this is the strategy that you will find in tropical areas. It will range all the way from what you found in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Far East. What you would do would be to go into an area that is covered with tropical rainforest. And you would have to clear out the trees. You would have to clear out the brush. So they would go in with their knives, their bush knives, or they would go in with their axes and cut down all of the trees, beat back all of the bushes, virtually clear out the major forest. Then they would set all of that on fire. Now, they didn't just waste all of that lumber. They would take the best lumber, use it for building their houses, use it for building a fence, use it for firewood, the junk wood, the wood that was not good for structural stuff, the stuff that would become quickly infected by termites, they would burn. They would burn all that brush, all of the junk lumber, and they would create what we call potash or ashes in the soil. Now, the ashes in the soil would actually return a lot of the nutrients from the trees back into the soil. So you are actually fertilizing the soil through the ash of the burnt brush and trees. Then they would start planting. And gardens would move through 5 stages. The first one would be virgin rainforest. No garden has ever been planted there. So you come in there and you've got trees that could be 25, 50, 75 feet tall. You would cut those down and you would garden. And you'd say, wow, we've just cleaned out 4 acres of pristine virgin jungle. We've now made a garden and we can garden it forever and ever and ever and ever. Wrong. Because there is a problem with tropical rainforests. It rains. And it rains. And it rains some more. In the tropics, you can measure rainfall in terms of feet rather than inches. It is not at all uncommon to have 10 feet of rain per year. Now, on our little tour, we went up to Alaska, and we were in Juneau. And we took a tour of the tropical forest, or not the rainforest in Juneau. And that's what she told us. It rains about 9 feet a year up here. They have 30 days of sunshine in Juneau every year. I thought Seattle was bad. Seattle looks like the sun capital of Arizona compared to Juneau. It's horrible up there. And twice the sun came out while we were at, the girl said, look, sunlight. Oh, we haven't seen that in weeks. Huh? 20 minutes, it's gone. Clouds all over again. Okay, well, if you've got 10 feet of rainfall, you know what happens? The rain will wash all the nutrients into the soil, deep into the soil below the root level of plants. So the soil is unable to sustain growth. And you say, oh, wait a minute. How can you have all of these lush rainforest trees if the soil is so sterile? Look again at the rainforest. Every plant that survives there is either very small or very large with a root system that goes out dozens of feet. As a matter of fact, when you look at the root system of tropical rainforests, you will see trees that might have a root span of 50 feet from that all the way to the other side. These huge root systems will reach out in order to spread a broad base of soil upon which to draw their nourishment. Furthermore, those roots are not real deep. They don't go down real deep because they got to go down too deep. There will be no taproot, no root that goes all the way down. It's all very, very shallow and on the surface. And the soil is constantly renourished by what? By leaves, huge broad leaves that continually fall onto the valley floor and rot and create kind of its own natural mulch. If you go into the jungle, you will smell the smell of jungle. And that smell is rotting. It is the formation of mulch. And there are all kinds of creatures down there that will help to turn it into mulch real fast. You know, leaf-eating creatures, creatures that eat one another. And there's this constant struggle for survival as the living becomes dead to become back into becoming the living. And so you clean all that off. And now there is no natural nutrients to go back into the soil. The soil quickly becomes sterile. So you can grow food on a new garden for maybe 1-2 years maximum. Then you've got to create a new garden. So what do you do with the old garden? Well, you let it go into what we would call fallow. You don't plant anything there. After 2 years, you move off. You let nature take its course. And in the fallow period, you start getting weeds coming back. You start getting little scrub brush. Pigs may run around in there and root around and try to find a few scrawny potatoes left over from the garden. But it begins to return back to virgin territory. Next thing you know, the little scrub brush begins to grow into 6-foot tall trees, then 12-foot tall trees, and finally up into 25-foot tall trees. The soil will renew itself. And when it does renew itself, you can come back and say, hey, you know, 10 years ago we planted a garden here. Look at how the trees are growing here. This is good soil again. We can replant on this site. That's when you get the 5th stage then, which is the ability to replant gardens. Let me just show you a little picture of a valley. This is the valley where I lived. The aluminum houses in the center of the picture are where the government post was, so the government is there. The pictures down on the right lower half, those are some of our missionary houses. There's a hospital there in our houses. But I want you to look up valley. Look over here to the left, and you see on the hillside some cleaned off fields. Those were former gardens. They have now gone into fallow. There's no food being planted there. This is being returned back to jungle. You look over to the right, and you see this little hillside that's sticking down there like a finger into the main valley. The trees on this hill are maybe 10 to 12 feet tall. they are first and second stage growth return to forest. You look way up at the top, and actually those are still active gardens there in the middle. There's where they are gardening today. And when it comes to virgin growth, well, way off up there into the mountainside is virgin rainforest that has not yet been turned into gardening. This is a very typical scene in slash and burn agriculture. Well, we move away from horticulture, simply growing enough food for your family, to what we call intensive agriculture. Now, in intensive agriculture, we're going to develop our strategies for growing food. We're going to be able to spend less time growing more food through the use of these growing strategies. And this will require the use of a plow and a draft animal. Once we discovered the ability to harness oxen, horses, water buffalo, or other draft animals, we can now start pulling plows. The plows will begin very simply with a single blade led by a single man as he gets the draft animal to pull the plow through the field. Now it's more than just a woman with a digging stick wearing herself out in the garden. It is a man with the power of a draft animal plowing a field that will multiply the capacity to grow food. A second innovation that's going to take place under intensive agriculture is the ability to channel water into the fields. And there will be a variety of irrigation techniques that are used. Sometimes they'll use flooding techniques where they will divert a river into an open field and allow it to flood. Other times they will build channels. Other times they will develop water wheels that will bring water out of a river and dump it then into the field. A whole variety of irrigation techniques that will bring water to land that was otherwise incapable of sustaining growth or because there wasn't sufficient rain. There is also the systematic use of fertilizer. They figured out how to grow more intense quantities of food by putting fertilizer on those spots. I remember a Donny young man who came to me and he said, Hayward, he said, you got some cows up in the field up there. We had brought some cows in. We were trying to introduce cattle as a means of improving the diet of the Donny. And he said, I've discovered that I've got a place where I grow some bananas. And if I put cow manure on that spot, I can have more bananas, bigger bananas than ever before. He said, would it be all right with you if I went and I gathered some of your manure from your pasture to put on my bananas? I said, sure, help yourself. He had learned the lesson of fertilizing. It will improve food productivity. You do not have to allow for simple soil nutrients to take care of the food needs. So, with the innovation now of plow animals, irrigation, fertilizer, we can start bigger gardens, gardens further away, gardens that will utilize land that was not previously available for growing food. So, depending on the region, you will come up with a variety of intensive gardening techniques. One is what we call wet rice farming. Now, wet rice farming is what you see in Asia. You will see it all through Indonesia, the Philippines, Southeast Asia, China, Japan. This is the typical system where they will terrace a mountainside and allow water to start flowing down from springs at the upper end, and it will come down. They'll have a terrace garden with a little bank. It'll fill up that pond. Then there'll be a runoff place that'll run into the plot below, and then from there, the plot below, till it comes all the way down to the bottom of the mountain. In order to have wet rice farming, you have to create a system of paddies, of dikes, of flow of water. This will require a major expenditure of energy as you terrace off the mountain or off of the fields, however you're going to do it. In Thailand, we've driven up and down that country, and you see miles and miles of beautiful rice paddies, all on level land, but the water will be brought in from a slightly higher channel into those rice paddies. If you do have wet rice farming, you can have up to 2 to 3 harvests per year. Now, when I was in Irian Jaya, we went up to a valley that was about 9,500 feet in altitude. 9,500 feet, at least at that latitude, is about the upper limits of human habitation on a permanent basis. You get any higher than that, you get too much of a cold snap, you get too much frost, it will kill the crops. As a matter of fact, in the several years that we were there, we saw at least 3 cold snaps that completely destroyed the harvest, and the people had to move out of the area until a new crop of food went in. It would take extra time for crops to come into harvest at that altitude, and only certain kinds of foods would grow up there. But down here, where you've got wet rice farming, instead of getting just 1 crop per year, you could get 2 to 3 crops per year. It would have, of course, humongous ecological consequences, because you would have to reshape water flow, land usage, the way the land is terraced, and you would have to bring the land under cultivation rather than its natural state of existence. Now, that's wet rice farming. In North America and in Europe and in other places, you have what we call cash cropping or grain farming. One of the things that we discovered, particularly beginning in the Middle East, is the use of grains. And in the use of grains, we're growing wheat, we're growing barley, we're growing other products that can be turned into flour. We start growing these, we can put them into storage bins as long as we can keep the rats and the mold and the insects out of them. We can keep them for years. We start growing larger quantities of grains, and we can start transporting them for sale. So we start developing what is called monocrop gardening, where you will have acres and acres of growing 1 crop. Now, the thing that surprised me tremendously when I was in Irian Jaya was to see farmers growing corn, cabbage, beets, sweet potatoes, all in the same general area. And I thought, what a silly way to grow food. You know, because we always had, this is where I got the corn, here's where I got the cabbage, here's where I got the carrots. We'd put it all in nice little rows. That's a heritage from monocrop gardening. They would grow it all depending upon the type of soil, and actually the corn would give shade from the heat of the sun to the carrots that were below them. It was actually a fairly good idea. But we started coming up with monocrop gardening so that we could specialize in the kinds of food that we were producing. And we would seek to grow that food for resale, not for personal use. You know what? You can only eat so many grapes until you are graped out. But if you could do something with those grapes, if you can sell them or dry them, turn them into raisins, or ferment them into wine, then you can sell them on the marketplace. So you can start growing for market. And it's not for personal use anymore. As a matter of fact, I used to have a supporter who owned a chunk of land out in Arizona. And he was a business entrepreneur, lived in Santa Barbara. He bought this chunk of land out in Arizona. He spent an enormous sum of money to dig a deep well, struck an underground lake, got all the water he wanted, and was growing 400 acres of alfalfa. Now, why would you want 400 acres of alfalfa? When was the last time you had an alfalfa salad? We don't eat it. What do we do with alfalfa? Well, I used to say we would then sell the alfalfa to farmers who would feed it to their cows, who would then sell it to McDonald's, and you would buy it as a hamburger. But then I had a student who grew up on a farm, and she said, Hayward, you don't feed meat cattle alfalfa. You feed alfalfa to milk cows. So, okay, I got corrected. He's growing alfalfa for dairy farmers or whoever wants to buy his alfalfa. He's still got to go to the grocery store to buy a loaf of bread. He could grow wheat. He could grow carrots, but he's not doing it. He buys them at the grocery store and he sells all of this money or all of this product that he grows to other consumers. Well, what is the social impact of intensive agriculture? Let's take a look at what comes out of it. First of all, you can get more food on smaller plots. So 1 acre of land is now going to produce more food with intensive agriculture to feed more people than horticulture or even foraging cultures. This is going to allow for population to increase very, very dramatically. Because we can get more food on smaller plots, we're going to be able to feed more people, and more people are going to be able to live as part of our community. Let's look at how this plays out. If you have a hunting and gathering culture, that's what H&G stands for. In a hunting and gathering culture, you can feed one person per square mile of naturally producing non-agricultural lands. Now, what do we got? 20 miles between us and the Pacific Ocean. And let's go down to Disneyland. That's 10 miles from here, maybe? So from here to Disneyland to the ocean, how many square acres do we have, or square miles do we have there? Nobody here takes a math class, huh? Doesn't 10 by 20 come out to 200? Okay, 200 square miles. That means from here to Disneyland to the coast, we could support a population of 200 people just on hunting and gathering. But that's all. Now, what happens if we start doing horticulture? Now, anthropologists have gone around the globe looking at horticultural societies, and one of the things they discovered that one of the most intense regions of the world for horticultural production was the Balim Valley in Irian Jaya, just a few miles from where I was. And they discovered that through the use of horticulture techniques. A good fertile valley, well-watered, well-drained, they could get anywhere from 220 to 440 people per square mile. Do you see how you can build up your population? You could not build a heavy population in Southern California because they would have died off. This is why the Native American population here was so very small. In contrast to the Grand Valley Donny in the Baalim, where you could get up to 200 to 440 people could live off of 1 square mile of land. In contrast, wet rice farming. And here we're going to draw our examples from Java. You can feed 1,200 people per square mile. See the difference? 1,200 people per square mile versus 1 per square mile in pre-contact California. This is the ecological consequence, the population consequence of being able to have intensive agriculture. A third major impact of intensive agriculture is that it frees people for specialization. If I could have one farmer growing enough food for 10 people, then 9 don't have to be growing food. What can they do? Some of them can spend full time being members of the military to protect the farmers. They can be artisans who will make pretty things. You can have people who are involved in making cloth out of animal products. You can have people who are specialists in religion. You can have a scholarly class. You can have teachers, people who can live off of the work of the farmers, and you start specializing and advancing your culture. So specialization emerges. Boat builders, sailors, other occupations. The problem, of course, is that it requires more social control. The more people you bring together, the more you have to spend time addressing their problems, meeting their needs, resolving conflicts, creating the conditions under which people in close association can live together. And it will have permanent ecological impacts because it will require more land to be under cultivation. Therefore, you will have fewer trees. One of the things that we discovered in the Western Donny, we introduced new strategies for taking care of children. Remember I told you that up to half of the children died before the age of 5? We decided that we would try to address this problem. So we trained a core of women in prenatal and postnatal children's care. We also trained a number of women as midwives. So more children were being born, there were more live births, children were surviving longer, and immediately population began to increase. Now, all of a sudden, instead of 2.5 children surviving into adulthood, we're getting 5 children surviving into adulthood. All of a sudden now, we need more garden space. We need more villages. We need to cut down more trees. And as I look at pictures of people who now go to where I used to live, and they put their pictures back up on Facebook or YouTube, and I discover that some of those valleys that I just showed you are completely deforested now. There are ecological consequences as a result of population increases, and we need to be aware of that. Now, any of you here from the San Joaquin Valley, the whole Central Valley area, Merced, Modesto, Fresno, Bakersfield, yeah, love that. Great agricultural basket for California. California grows 1/3 of the world's table vegetables. And most of it's grown either in the Imperial Valley or the San Joaquin. But what happens when they want to make a new farm out there? The first thing they do is they bring in bulldozers. And that nice rolling hillside, they level it all out. Now, why do they level it all out? So that they can make it effective for irrigation purposes. And depending on what kind of irrigation system they're going to use, they either make it thoroughly level or on a slight incline so that irrigation water can be brought in at the top and allowed to trickle down. But they will completely change the landscape with land scrapers and bulldozers. They will change the geology significantly. And then, of course, if there's any other growth on there, they'll cut that all down and they will plant their food. Now, one of the problems that we've run into as we go into intensive agriculture is that we have sometimes been less than wise regarding how to use land. And they used to say that for every bushel of corn that was grown in the Midwest, a bushel of topsoil was washed down the Mississippi River. Now we're learning how to preserve the topsoil of the Midwest. We're learning to become more ecologically sensitive, but it does change it forever. Furthermore, it does require more energy consumption. It takes a lot of energy to do intensive agriculture. If you're using machinery, it takes gasoline, it takes metal, it takes iron, it takes tires, it takes all kinds of energy. The energy output for intensive agriculture is exceedingly high compared to stick agriculture. Poke a hole, drop a seed, cover it over. Minimum energy. But when you're growing a huge field of rice or of wheat, the energy consumption is very, very high. Well,
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.
Pristine states next time.